This photograph was taken in the winter of 1884 in a studio on Kirkgate Street, Bradford, England. A father, a mother, 3 of their children. It looks like every other family portrait from the era. Stiff, formal, slightly uncomfortable. The father stands behind his seated wife, one hand resting on the back of her chair. The 2 older children flank them on either side. And in the center, seated perfectly upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, is a girl of about 6 years old. Nothing about this photograph seems wrong. At least, not until you add color. When this image was fed into an AI colorization tool, software trained on millions of living human faces, something happened that no one expected. The father's coat turned a deep, worn brown. The mother's cheeks flushed with the faintest pink. The older children's skin warmed the way living skin should. But the girl in the center did not warm. Her skin turned a flat, grayish lavender. Her lips stayed colorless. Her cheeks held no blood beneath the surface, and her eyes, wide open, staring directly into the lens, colorized in a texture that didn't match any of the living faces around her. They looked painted. Because they were. Everyone else in this photograph gained color. She gained something else, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 140 years. The girl in the center of this portrait had been dead for approximately 2 days when the shutter opened. Who was she? What killed her? And why did her family pay money they didn't have to sit beside her body for an hour and stare into a lens? The answers to those questions lead somewhere none of us expected, not to a single tragedy, but to an industry, an economy, an entire world that profited from the death of children. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because this channel finds the stories that history tried to bury. Ruth Gallagher is 58 years old. She spent 31 years as a school librarian in Dewsbury before she retired. Now, 3 mornings a week, she volunteers at the West Yorkshire Archives Service in Wakefield, where her job is to catalog the belongings of the dead. That's not how they describe it, of course. Officially, she processes donations from estate clearances, boxes of personal effects surrendered by families who don't want them, or recovered from the homes of people who died without heirs. Most of what passes through Ruth's hands is exactly what you'd expect. Expired insurance policies, ration books from a war no one alive remembers, bundles of letters in handwriting so cramped and faded that no one will ever read them again. Ordinary things, the small paperwork of small lives. But on the morning of February 14th, 2022, a box arrived from a demolished terrace house on Lum Lane in Bradford. And inside it was something that was not ordinary at all. The box was a standard archive transfer crate, cardboard taped shut, marked with a reference number and the address of origin. Ruth cut the tape and lifted the lid. Inside, she found a cracked leather Bible, its spine split and its pages yellowed to the color of weak tea. Beside it, a mourning brooch, a small oval of dark metal with a twist of brown hair pressed behind a disc of clouded glass. 3 loose buttons, a length of ribbon that might once have been black but had faded to the gray of old smoke. And pressed between pages 67 and 68 of the Book of Psalms, a photograph. A carte de visite, roughly 4 inches by 2.5, mounted on stiff card. 5 figures arranged in a studio with a painted backdrop depicting a garden that had never existed. No names written on the back, but along the lower border a photographer's stamp, partially faded by time and pressure. Denby, Portrait and Memorial, Kirkgate, Bradford. Ruth had catalogued hundreds of Victorian photographs. They were not uncommon in estate donations. But this one made her stop. She held it under the sorting lamp and stared at it, and she couldn't explain, at first, what had caught her attention. Then she realized. The girl in the center, she was too perfect, too still, while everyone else in the frame carried the slightly blurred softness that came from holding a pose during a long exposure, the father's hand faintly smeared, the mother's head carrying a ghost of movement. The girl was razor-sharp. Every eyelash, every fold of her collar, every thread of the lace at her wrists. As if she hadn't moved at all, as if she couldn't. Ruth scanned the photograph at high resolution. She'd been watching videos online about AI colorization, tools that could add realistic color to black and white and sepia images using neural networks trained on modern photographs of living people. Out of curiosity, she uploaded Edith's scan to one of these tools. The result came back in seconds, and it changed everything. The software knew what blood beneath skin looked like. It knew what warmth did to pigment, what capillaries did to cheeks, what moisture did to the surface of a human eye. And when it reached the girl in the center of that photograph, it failed. Not because it was broken, because it was too accurate. It could not make dead tissue look alive. The girl's skin rendered as a flat gray violet. Her fingers, slightly swollen, locked into a curl that no living hand would hold, appeared faintly mottled. And the eyes, those wide, staring eyes, the AI colorized them in an entirely different texture than the living eyes around her. The software had detected what the naked eye could not, that those irises were not organic. They were pigment, paint, applied by brush onto closed eyelids. Ruth sat at her desk for a long time without moving. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Alastair Pemberton, a lecturer in Victorian social history at the University of Leeds. She had met him at a cataloging workshop 2 years earlier and remembered that he had published on death customs in industrial Yorkshire. She emailed him the scan. His reply came within the hour. It read, "Yes, this is a memorial portrait. The child is deceased. But Ruth, look at the photographer's stamp again. Denby. I've seen that name before in a very different context." Ruth had uncovered the first secret of this photograph. The girl was dead. But that, it turned out, was the least disturbing thing hidden inside this frame. Dr. Pemberton came to the archive the following week. He and Ruth sat together at a sorting table under fluorescent lights and examined the high-resolution scan with the kind of attention a detective would give a crime scene photograph. They started with what the camera had recorded and the eye had missed. First, the motion blur. The father's left hand showed a faint smear where he had shifted during the exposure, roughly 15 to 30 seconds for an indoor portrait in the 1880s. The mother's head carried a subtle ghosting. The two older children displayed micro-movement in their shoulders, but the girl in the center was flawless. No motion artifact whatsoever, no tremor, no breath. She was the only person in that room who could not move. Second, the base of the frame. Partially hidden by the girl's skirt, 2 dark metal prongs were visible, rising from the floor behind her. Pemberton identified them immediately. A Brady stand, a cast-iron device with an adjustable clamp and brace system designed to hold a human body upright. These stands were manufactured in Birmingham and sold through photographic supply catalogs of the period. They were listed alongside tripods and lens cases. No special section. No warning label. Just another piece of equipment. Third, the hands. Her fingers were curled in a way that did not match any natural resting position. The joints were locked. Pemberton looked at Ruth and said, "That's rigor mortis, positioned before it fully set. Whoever prepared her body knew they had a narrow window, a few hours at most, to arrange the limbs before they became immovable." And fourth, the eyes. Under magnification, the irises showed visible brushstrokes. Someone had painted open eyes directly onto her closed eyelids, using fine-tipped brushes and flesh-toned pigment. The AI colorization had failed on the eyes because the software detected paint texture where it expected organic tissue. The photograph was not merely a portrait of a dead child. It was a construction, a performance of life staged with iron and pigment and careful hands, designed to create a single illusion that this girl was still here. But who was she? The photograph came from a house on Lum Lane. Ruth turned to the census records. The 1881 England census for Lum Lane, Bradford, showed that a family named Hadfield occupied number 14. Thomas Hadfield, age 34, woolcomber. Mary Hadfield, née Sutcliffe, age 31, no listed occupation. Arthur Hadfield, age 7. Florence Hadfield, age 5. And Edith Hadfield, age 3. If this census was taken in 1881, and the photograph's style and materials dated it to roughly 1883 or 1884, then the girl in the portrait, if she was Edith, would have been 5 or 6 years old. The right age for the child in the photograph. Ruth searched the General Register Office death indices for Bradford, covering 1882 to 1885. And there it was. Edith Hadfield, death registered in the first quarter of 1884, January through March, Bradford Registration District. Age at death, 6. She ordered the full death certificate. It arrived 10 days later in a brown envelope with a crown stamp. The paper was a modern certified copy, but the information it carried was 140 years old. Cause of death, enteric fever 11 days, certified by Dr. H. Wainwright. Enteric fever, the Victorian term for typhoid, a disease caused by water or food contaminated with human sewage or industrial waste. Common in the industrial cities of the north, common in Bradford, common on Lum Lane. Edith Hadfield died of typhoid fever in the first months of 1884. She was 6 years old. Her family had her photograph taken after she was dead because they had never been able to afford one while she was alive. But Pemberton wasn't satisfied. He had already cross-referenced Edith's death with the Bradford Medical Officer of Health Annual Report for 1884, a public document that every industrial city was required to produce. And what he found in that report turned a personal tragedy into something far larger. The report noted what it called an unusual concentration of enteric fever cases in the Lum Lane and Manningham Lane corridor. 37 deaths from typhoid in a single quarter, disproportionately affecting children under the age of 10. 37 children, dead of the same waterborne disease on the same few streets in the same 3 months. That's not an epidemic, that's a pattern, and patterns have causes. Pemberton said it plainly. The question isn't just what killed Edith Hadfield. The question is what killed all of them, and whether anyone already knew and did nothing. Ruth now had a name, a date, and a cause of death. She had a photograph that revealed a dead child made to look alive. But 3 questions still had no answers. 1. Who was the photographer? And why did Dr. Pemberton already recognize his name? 2. Why were dozens of children dying of the same disease on the same streets in the same season? 3. Did anyone try to stop it? And what happened when they did? What Ruth found in the archives over the next 6 weeks would answer all 3 of those questions. And it would change how she understood not just this photograph, but every Victorian family portrait she had ever seen. Ruth began with the photographer's stamp. Denby, Portrait and Memorial, Kirkgate, Bradford. She searched the 1881 census and found him. William Denby, age 41, listed occupation, photographic artist. Address, Kirkgate, Bradford. She then turned to the Bradford trade directories, published annually, listing every business in the city by category, and traced his studio from 1878 to 1891. 13 years of continuous operation. His advertisements read the same way year after year. Portraits, cartes de visite, cabinet cards, and memorial likenesses taken at the studio or at the family residence. Bereaved families attended with the utmost delicacy. Memorial likenesses, that was the polite phrase. The phrase you could print in a trade directory without disturbing anyone. It meant photographs of the dead. And William Denby, by the evidence of his own advertising, had made it not merely a sideline but a specialty. This was why Dr. Pemberton recognized the name. Denby's studio appeared again and again in records connected to child deaths in Bradford during the 1880s, not because he caused those deaths, but because he was there every time with his camera and his posing stand, ready to serve families who had just lost the thing they loved most. And he was far from alone. To understand what Edith Hadfield's photograph really means, you have to understand the world that produced it. Not just the grief of one family, but the economics of an entire system, a system that turned dead children into a functioning market. Start with the numbers. A studio portrait in the 1880s cost between 1 and 5 shillings, depending on the format and the number of prints. For a wool comber like Thomas Hadfield, earning roughly 18 to 22 shillings a week, even a single photograph represented a full day's labor, sometimes more. Most working-class families in Bradford went their entire lives without ever sitting for a camera. They could not afford it. Photography was something that happened to other people, wealthier people, people who lived in larger houses on wider streets. Now pair that with another number. Child mortality in Bradford in the 1880s stood at approximately 220 deaths for every 1,000 live births among children under 5. More than 1 in 5. In the poorest wards, Manningham, Black Abbey, the streets running alongside Bradford Beck, the rate climbed closer to 1 in 3. 1 in 3 children dead before their 5th birthday. Do the arithmetic. If your child was likely to die before you could save enough for a portrait, then the camera would meet them only once, and it would be after they were gone. This was not macabre, it was mathematics, and it created a market. An entire industry grew around the business of photographing the dead. Posing stand manufacturers in Birmingham and Sheffield produced adjustable iron frames with padded clamps, devices engineered to hold a corpse upright as naturally as possible. These stands appeared in photographic supply catalogs alongside tripods and developing trays. They were listed on the same pages, ordered through the same channels. No separate section, no moral caveat, just another tool of the trade. Some photographers employed eye painters, miniaturists whose sole job was to create the illusion of open, living eyes on the faces of the deceased. They worked with tiny brushes and pigments matched to common iris colors, painting directly onto closed eyelids, or, in some cases, retouching the final photographic print to add eyes that had never opened for the camera. In wealthier families, a professional body preparer would wash, dress, and position the deceased before the photographer arrived. In working-class families, families like the Hadfields, the mother did it herself. She washed the body, she combed the hair, she buttoned the dress, she folded the hands. And after the photograph was taken, mourning stationers stood ready to print black-bordered memorial cards incorporating a small reproduction of the image, suitable for sending to distant relatives who would never see the child's face any other way. Posing stands, eye painters, memorial card printers. There was a supply chain for every stage of a child's death, and every link in that chain charged a fee. Ruth found the most damning evidence of this system not in a catalog or an advertisement, but in a ledger. Buried in the West Yorkshire Archives' uncatalogued holdings was a partial studio ledger attributed to Denby's practice, covering the years 1882 to 1886. It had been donated decades earlier as part of a larger collection of Bradford commercial records. No one had examined it closely. No one had reason to. Until now. The ledger was organized simply. Each entry recorded a client's surname, the date of the sitting, the type of portrait, standard, cabinet, or memorial, the fee charged, and occasionally a brief handwritten note. Child age approx. 4. Infant 7 months. Mother deceased, attended by husband. Ruth turned to the entry's marked memorial and began to count. In 1883, Denby's studio produced 31 memorial portraits. In 1884, the number was 54. 54 dead people photographed in a single year, by a single photographer in a single city. And then Ruth noticed something else, the addresses. They were not scattered evenly across Bradford, they clustered. The same few streets appeared entry after entry, page after page. Lum Lane, Manningham Lane, Heaton Road, Victor Street, all of them within a quarter mile of one another, all of them running alongside the same waterway. Bradford Beck. Ruth had found the photographer. She had found his records. She had found Edith's name in a ledger of the dead. But the ledger didn't just record deaths. It drew a map. And that map pointed to something that no one in 1884 had been willing to say out loud. To understand what the map revealed, you need to understand how the Hadfields lived. Thomas Hadfield worked as a wool comber at Thornton and Sons Worsted Mill, one of several large manufactories clustered in the Manningham area of Bradford. The work was physical and relentless, combing raw wool fibers straight using heated metal combs, hour after hour, in air thick with fiber dust and the smell of lanolin. The mill sat on the banks of Bradford Beck, the narrow stream that wound through the center of the city. Thomas worked 6 days a week, from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening. His weekly wage was approximately 18 to 22 shillings. Rent for a back-to-back terrace house on Lum Lane, 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down, shared privy in the yard, took 4 to 5 shillings of that. What remained was 13 to 17 shillings a week to feed, clothe, and warm a family of 5. A memorial portrait at Denby's studio cost 2 shillings and 6 pence, more than a full day's labor at the mill. Mary Hadfield had 3 surviving children. She had also buried 2. Ruth found in the parish burial records for Bradford that the Hadfields had lost an infant named George in 1880. He was 5 weeks old. Cause of death listed on the burial register: convulsions. A catch-all term, it could have meant almost anything. It almost certainly meant that no one had the resources to find out. 2 children buried before either reached the age of 7, and the Hadfields were not exceptional. On their street alone, on Lum Lane alone, the burial registers recorded 14 child deaths in an 18-month span. 14 small coffins carried out of one row of terrace houses. Ruth and Dr. Pemberton now turned to the document that would bind everything together. The full Bradford Medical Officer of Health report for 1884, authored by the city's appointed health officer, a man tasked with monitoring disease, inspecting sanitary conditions, and advising the council on public health. The report ran to dozens of pages. Most of it was routine, tables of birth and death rates, summaries of infectious disease notifications, descriptions of housing inspections. But in a section addressing what the author called the enteric fever question, there was a passage that stopped Ruth cold. It read, "The prevalence of enteric fever in the Lum Lane and adjacent streets may be attributed in no small part to the condition of the water supply, which draws from sources contaminated by the effluent of neighboring manufactories. The Beck water, upon analysis, has been found to contain organic matter and chemical pollutants at levels injurious to health. I have recommended to the council that the affected wells be closed and a new supply established. This recommendation has not, as of the date of writing, been acted upon." He knew. The medical officer of health knew the water was poisoned. He tested it. He analyzed it. He identified the source. The mills along Bradford Beck were dumping their waste into the same waterway that fed the wells from which families like the Hadfields drew their drinking water. He wrote it down in clear, unambiguous language. He submitted it to the council. He recommended that the contaminated wells be closed and a clean supply established. And the council did nothing. Dr. Pemberton explained why. Bradford City Council in the 1880s was not a neutral body. Its members were drawn overwhelmingly from the city's commercial class: wool merchants, mill owners, manufacturers. The men who sat on the committees that decided where public money was spent were, in many cases, the same men whose factories lined the banks of the Beck, the same men whose effluent flowed into the water, the same men who would have borne the cost of a new, clean supply. They were asked to regulate themselves. They chose not to. The water that killed Edith Hadfield flowed from a mill whose owner sat on the council that refused to stop it. We don't know the exact date. The entry in Denby's ledger reads, "Hadfield Memorial, Child F. Approx. Age 6, 26D, Lum Lane." It falls between entries dated February 19th and February 26th, 1884. Edith had been dead for 1 or 2 days. What follows is a reconstruction, built not from imagination but from documented accounts of how Victorian memorial photography was practiced in working-class homes across industrial England. Every detail that follows has a basis in the historical record. Only the specific words and gestures are inferred. Mary Hadfield washed her daughter's body. She would have used cold water and a cloth. She dressed Edith in what the family likely called a Sunday frock, the only good dress the child owned, kept clean and pressed for church and for occasions that the family could not yet know would include this one. She brushed and arranged Edith's hair. She may have tied a ribbon in it. She folded the small hands. Thomas Hadfield walked to Denby's studio on Kirkgate Street, approximately 10 minutes on foot from Lum Lane, to arrange the sitting and pay in advance. 2 shillings and 6 pence. Roughly 14 hours of his labor at the mill, counted out in coins across a photographer's counter. Either Denby came to the house, or the family carried Edith's body to the studio. Both practices were common and documented. Neither would have drawn comment from the neighbors. Death was visible in Victorian Bradford. It walked the streets openly. Everyone on Lum Lane had, at some point, carried a small body or watched someone else do it. In the studio, Denby or an assistant positioned Edith in a chair. They fitted the Brady stand behind her, iron prongs supporting her back and the base of her skull, hidden by the chair and by the fabric of her dress. They arranged her hands in her lap. They may have used small pins, inserted through the fabric, to hold her fingers in the desired position. Then came the eyes. Using a fine-tipped brush and pigments mixed to approximate the color of a living iris, someone, Denby himself, or an assistant trained in miniature painting, painted open eyes onto Edith's closed eyelids. 2 small circles of manufactured life on a face that held none. The goal was simple and impossibly ambitious, to make a dead child look as though she were merely sitting for a portrait, as though she might blink. Thomas, Mary, Arthur, and Florence took their places. The 2 older children stood on either side. Thomas stood behind his wife. Mary sat beside Edith, her right hand resting on the girl's forearm. The hand served 2 purposes. The first was love. The second was structural. It helped hold the body in place. Denby uncapped the lens. For 15 to 30 seconds, an eternity when you are sitting beside the body of your child and trying not to breathe, no one moved. Or rather, everyone tried not to move and failed. Thomas's hand shifted. Mary's head turned a fraction of a degree. Arthur's shoulders swayed. Florence's chin dropped slightly. But Edith did not move. She could not tremble. She could not flinch. She could not look away. And because of that, she became the sharpest figure in the frame. The most perfectly rendered face. The clearest pair of eyes, even though those eyes were paint. 1 photograph, 1 copy. The only image of Edith Hadfield's face that would ever exist. 2 shillings and 6pence. 14 hours of a wool comber's labor. That was the price of proving that his daughter had lived. For 140 years, this photograph was read one way, as a family portrait. Then, when Ruth applied the AI colorization, it was read a second way, as a post-mortem photograph, a relic of a strange and morbid Victorian custom. But there is a third way to read this image, and it is the one that matters most. The photograph is inadvertent evidence of industrial negligence. When Ruth cross-referenced Denby's ledger with the General Register Office death indices and the Medical Officer of Health report, a pattern emerged that no single document could have revealed on its own. Of the 54 memorial portraits Denby's studio produced in 1884, at least 23 were of children under the age of 10. Of those 23, at least 14 lived within a quarter mile of Bradford Beck, in the Manningham and Lum Lane corridor. Of those 14, at least 9 died of enteric fever, or what the records called gastric fever, both terms associated with waterborne bacterial infection consistent with typhoid. 9 children, same water, same disease, same streets, same months. Photographed by the same man in the same studio, propped upright by the same iron stand. And on the other side of the city, the men who poisoned that water voted themselves into office and drank from a private supply. No one conspired. No one needed to. The system worked on its own. The mill poisoned the water killed the children, the families paid to photograph the dead, and the men who caused the deaths never saw the photographs, never held the small stiff card in their hands, never looked into the painted eyes. The photograph was never entered into evidence. It was never shown to a factory inspector or a health board or a member of parliament. It was never used to argue for clean water or closed wells or accountability. It was pressed into a Bible, placed between the Psalms, and carried from house to house as the family moved through the years. And eventually, it was left behind, sealed into the walls of a terrace house on Lum Lane that stood for over a century before the demolition crews arrived. But it survived, and now, because an algorithm trained on living faces could not make dead skin look alive, it speaks. Ruth Gallagher had solved the mystery of the photograph, but she still had one question left. What happened to the rest of them? Ruth traced the Hadfield family forward through the records, year by year, document by document. The 1891 census, 7 years after Edith's death, showed Thomas and Mary Hadfield still living on Lum Lane, still in the same house. Arthur, now 17, had left school and was working at a different mill. Florence, 15, was listed as a worsted spinner. There were two new names in the household, Walter, age 5, and Ida, age 3. Edith's name, of course, did not appear. Thomas Hadfield died in 1903 at the age of 56. His death certificate recorded the cause as chronic bronchitis and cardiac failure, a combination entirely consistent with 3 decades of inhaling wool fiber dust in an unventilated mill. He never left Bradford. He never lived anywhere but Lum Lane and the streets immediately surrounding it. Mary Hadfield survived her husband by 11 years. She died in 1914 at the age of 64 in a workhouse infirmary. The parish records do not say which workhouse. They do not say whether anyone was with her. But Florence survived. She married in 1897. She had 4 children, and all 4 of them lived to adulthood. Florence Hadfield's children survived because a new generation of health officers and sanitary reformers finally forced the council to act. New water mains were laid. Contaminated wells were sealed. Sewage systems were rebuilt. It took 20 years of pressure, 20 years of reports, 20 years of evidence that men in power did not want to read. 20 years too late for Edith. The practice of memorial photography itself did not end with a single decision or a single law. It faded. 2 forces killed it, and neither had anything to do with morality. The first was technology. In 1900, the Eastman Kodak Company released the Brownie camera, a simple box that sold for $1. For the first time in history, ordinary families could take their own photographs. Dozens of them, hundreds. A child could be photographed at birth, at her first steps, at school, at play, at every birthday. The memorial portrait was no longer the only chance. It was no longer necessary. The second force was survival. Public health reform, the sanitary acts, the public health acts, the slow grinding work of medical officers and inspectors and reformers gradually reduced child mortality across England. In Bradford, the rate fell from over 200 per thousand in the 1880s to under 130 per thousand by 1910. Fewer children died. Fewer parents needed to sit beside a small body in a cold studio and pretend, for the length of an exposure, that their child was still alive. By the 1920s, memorial photography was considered morbid, strange, something the Victorians did in their peculiar darkness. What had been an act of love became, in the eyes of a new century, an act of horror. The practice didn't die because people's feelings changed. It died because fewer children did. The photograph stayed in the Hadfield family's Bible for decades. When number 14 Lum Lane was scheduled for demolition in 2021, a clearance crew found the Bible in a gap between the walls of an upstairs room. It had been placed there deliberately, wedged between the plaster and the stone, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had mostly rotted away. No one knows exactly when it was hidden. No one knows who put it there, but Ruth believes it was Mary before she entered the workhouse, before she left the house for the last time. She put the Bible in the wall, and inside the Bible she left the only photograph of her daughter's face. She left it there the way people leave messages in bottles, not knowing who would find it, not knowing when, not knowing whether it would matter. It sat in the dark for more than a century. Then a house was torn down, a box was packed, a volunteer opened a Bible, an algorithm tried to add color to a dead girl's skin, and failed. Look at this photograph one more time. She is the sharpest person in the frame. She always will be, because she was the only one who could not move, could not breathe, could not look away. Her parents paid 14 hours of wages so that she would not be erased, so that the future would know she had a face, and a name, and a place in a family that loved her. But the photograph tells more than they meant it to. It tells us about the water she drank, and the men who poisoned it, and the council that chose roads over children, and a photographer who made his living in the space between grief and commerce. It tells us that in 1884, in Bradford, England, a 6-year-old girl named Edith Hadfield was killed by indifference. And the only reason we know her face is because her family sat beside her dead body in a cold studio, stared into a camera, and refused to let her disappear. She wasn't breathing, but she was remembered. If this story meant something to you, you don't need me to tell you what to do, but I'll ask anyway. Leave her name in the comments. Edith Hadfield, because names are how we prove someone was here.